The OPCW itself had declared that the Syrian government's chemical weapons stockpile had been removed in 2014. U.S. locked and loaded. Should another gas attack occur, Damascus, international inspectors launched their investigation Sunday into an alleged chemical attack near Damascus that prompted an unprecedented wave of Western strikes against Syria's regime. Russian President Vladimir Putin, the regime's top ally, warned that fresh strikes would spark chaos, but Washington vowed economic sanctions against Moscow rather than further military action. U.S., French and British missiles destroyed sites suspected of hosting chemical weapons development and storage facilities Saturday, but the buildings were mostly empty and the Western trio swiftly reverted to its diplomatic efforts. U.S. President Donald Trump lauded the perfectly executed strike, the biggest international attack on President Bashar al-Assad's regime during Syria's 7-year war, but both Damascus and Syria's opposition rubbished its impact. A team of chemical experts from the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, based in The Hague, arrived in Damascus hours after the strikes. They have been tasked with investigating the site of the alleged April 7 attack in the town of Douma, just east of the capital Damascus, which Western powers said involved chlorine and sarin and killed dozens. They arrived in Damascus on Saturday, but there were no reports they yet had traveled to Douma to begin their field work. An AFP reporter saw Deputy Foreign Minister Faisal Moqdad enter the Four Seasons hotel where the chemical experts are staying and leave 3 hours later. The fact-finding team usually starts its investigation by meeting top officials, but any talks were held behind closed doors and both parties imposed a strict media blackout. We will ensure they can work professionally, objectively, impartially and free of any pressure. Assistant Foreign Minister Ayman Sosan told AFP. The OPCW itself had declared that the Syrian government's chemical weapons stockpile had been removed in 2014, only to confirm later that sarin was used in a 2017 attack in the northern town of Khanchikan. Difficult task. The inspectors will face a difficult task, with all key players having preempted their findings, including Western powers, which justified the strikes by claiming they already had proof such weapons were used. The OPCW team will also have to deal with the risk that evidence may have been removed from the site, which lies in an area that has been controlled by Russian military police and Syrian forces over the past week. That possibility always has to be taken into account, and investigators will look for evidence that shows whether the incident site has been tampered with. Ralph Trapp, a consultant and member of a previous OPCW mission to Syria, told AFP. The Syrian military late Saturday declared eastern Ghouta, the former rebel enclave of which Douma is the main town, fully retaken after a blistering 2-month assault. Wresting back the opposition stronghold on the doorstep of Damascus had been a priority for the resurgent regime. U.S. leader Trump hailed the pre-dawn strikes that lit up the sky around Damascus and exclaimed, "Mission accomplished," on Twitter. That drew derision from his critics and parallels with President George W. Bush's notoriously premature Iraq War victory speech on an aircraft carrier almost exactly 15 years ago. According to American officials, the operation involved 3 U.S. destroyers, a French frigate and a U.S. submarine located in the Red Sea, the Gulf and the eastern Mediterranean. The U.S. Air Force confirmed on Sunday that B-1B bombers deployed at the Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar took part in the strikes. British Tornado and Typhoon warplanes and French Rafale jets also took part in the strikes. The Pentagon said no further action was planned, but Washington's envoy to the United Nations, Nikki Haley, warned that the U.S. was locked and loaded should another gas attack occur. Haley later told CBS that sanctions would be announced, likely on Monday, against Russian companies supplying the Syrian regime. British Foreign Minister Boris Johnson said the Syrian war would continue despite the successful strikes, saying the overwhelming purpose of the mission was to respond to repeated chemical attacks. French President Emmanuel Macron insisted that, "We have not declared war on the regime of Bashar al-Assad," Putin told his Iranian counterpart Hassan Rouhani, also an Assad ally, that any new Western strikes in Syria would provoke chaos in international relations. The two leaders found that this illegal action seriously damaged the prospects of a political settlement in Syria, a Kremlin statement said. Assad denounced a campaign of deceit and lies at the United Nations Security Council, after a push by Moscow on Saturday to condemn the strikes fell far short. Macron and other Western leaders have called for a diplomatic offensive after the strikes, aiming to end a conflict that has killed more than 350,000 people and displaced half of Syria's population. A Western draft resolution obtained by AFP at a meeting of the UN Security Council Saturday calls for unimpeded deliveries of humanitarian aid and enforcement of a ceasefire, along with demands that Syria engage in UN-led peace talks. But Russia has blocked countless resolutions against its Syrian ally, and the regime has appeared determined to continue its military reconquest of the country. For all the sound and fury of these strikes, their net effect is a slap on the wrist of Bashar al-Assad, said Nick Harris, an analyst at the Center for New American Security. Topics: Syria Damascus massacre in Douma. New sanctions aimed at companies dealing with equipment related to Assad and any chemical weapons use. U.S. Treasury Chief to announce new sanctions on Monday. London, Washington is preparing new economic sanctions on Russia for its support of Syrian President Bashar Assad and his continuing use of chemical weapons, the U.S. envoy to the United Nations said on Sunday. Ambassador Nikki Haley said the new sanctions, to be announced by Treasury Secretary Steven Mnuchin on Monday, targets Russian companies that are dealing with equipment related to Assad and any chemical weapons use. Russia needs to feel the consequences for protecting the Assad regime, Haley told CBS, Face the Nation. She pointed out that Russia has vetoed 6 resolutions in the UN Security Council regarding Syria's chemical weapons. The fact that Assad was making the use of chemical weapons more normal and that Russia was covering this up, all that has got to stop, she said. Syrian opposition activists and first responders say a chemical attack on the town of Douma, near the Syrian capital, killed more than 40 people on April 7. Haley also said that the U.S. will not have any one-on-one talks with Assad. She said Syria had so far refused to take part in multilateral negotiations as part of a political process facilitated by the United Nations, adding that Russia should deliver Syria to the negotiating table. But she said Syria was not worthy of direct talks with Washington. We are not going to have any one-on-one talks with Assad. Call for resumption of talks. Austrian Chancellor Sebastian Kurz, meanwhile, called for a resumption of Syrian peace talks, which took place in Vienna in 2015, to halt the bloodshed in the devastated country. Kurz said no military solution appeared possible in the conflict, which had already caused massive suffering for the Syrian people. After the shocking use of chemical weapons on April 7 and the recent Western military action in Syria, it is now the order of the day to remember reason and to press ahead with the diplomatic peace process with all necessary vigor, Kurz said in a statement on Sunday. The Syrian population had already suffered too much, with over 400,000 deaths and over 5 million refugees outside Syria. Kurz said there could be no military solution to the conflict and therefore appealed to all responsible actors to continue the peace talks of the International Syria Support Group, took place between 20 different groups in Vienna in 2015. A further escalation of the Syrian proxy war, or even a direct military conflict between the U.S. and Russia, must be prevented by all means, Kurz added in a statement received by Reuters. Austria has a long tradition as a place of dialogue and a bridge builder in conflicts, most recently in the Iranian nuclear deal, he said, with Austria ready to host talks over Syria at any time. Since Kurz, a conservative, formed a coalition government with the far-right and pro-Putin Freedom Party in December, Austria had repeatedly said it wants to serve as a bridge builder between East and West. It repeated that position when it declined to follow most other EU countries in expelling one or several Russian diplomats over the poisoning by nerve agent of a former Russian spy and his daughter in Salisbury, England. Britain has blamed the attack on Russia, but Vienna said it wanted to keep lines of communication with Moscow open, with agencies. Topics: Massacre in Douma. Nikki Haley. Russia UN Security Council, UNSC